enable the marbles to be appreciated, as I said, in their original context in which they were sculpted. So it's perhaps best summed up in the poetry of Constantine Cavafis, when he said, "It is not dignified in a great nation to reap profit from half-truths and half-rights. Honesty is the best policy, and honesty in the case of the Elgin marbles means restitution." Mr Speaker, campaigns to return the Elgin marbles to Greece have been a feature of the cultural landscape for many years, with many celebrities backing the campaign, most memorably the original host of 15 to 1, the late William G. Stewart. He delivered a speech in favour of the return in a 2001 episode, after all contestants were eliminated in the first round of the competition. Although a popular tea-time quiz show might not have been the best place to air his views, William G. Stewart's actions highlight the strength of feeling that people have towards the acquisition of these incredible sculptures. When public opinion on the return of the marbles has been tested, there has been consistent support for returning them to Greece. The most recent opinion poll by YouGov showed that more people in Britain favoured the return of the marbles than opposed it by a margin of 37% to 23%. Proponents of the reunification of the marbles have rightly pointed out that there is a moral case for their return. In an Intelligence Squared television debate on the subject, which is available on YouTube for any honourable members interested in the subject, both sides of the debate acknowledged that the circumstances in which the Elgin marbles are returned to Greece would be emblematic of Britain's status in the world. Those in favour... Yeah, I'm happy to give them.
Honourable friend, for giving me this. Is ever so slightly tangential, but she mentioned Intelligence Squared, who of course famously also hosted a debate between Professor Mary Beard and the man who is now Prime Minister. Is she as perturbed as I am, given the important role the British Museum has in this debate? Reports at the weekend that the government was trying to keep Professor Beard off the board of the British Museum, perhaps because of her Remain views, and does she agree that perhaps the Minister might want to respond to those in her closing remarks?
Friend for that, and it is very disappointing to hear of the treatment of Professor Mary Beard. It reveals a crucial flaw in the argument against the return of the marbles, but it is entirely within the UK Government's powers to appoint trustees who support repatriation. But I understand that the British Museum are going to take matters into their own hands anyway and appoint her. So Those in favour of repatriation, Mr Speaker, of the marbles suggested that returning the marbles to Greece would portray Britain as a benign influence in the world, keen to do right by others. Those in favour of retention said that their return would mark the decline of Britain's status as a global power. Either way, repatriating them would mark a sea change in how Britain is viewed in the world. But handled correctly, it could demonstrate that Britain is willing to ditch the colonial mindset for good. For me, the most prescient comment in the debate came from the former Liberal Democrat member for St Ives, Andrew George, who remarked that we can persist in clinging on to the Greek marbles as excuses wear thin until we're forced in some kind of cringe-making and rather shameful climb-down to hand them over in some decades to come. That brings us to the twin questions of why this debate and why raise this issue now. Last week, the UK Government published its much-awaited mandate for trade negotiations from the EU. Like many of my colleagues in these benches, I fear for the economic impact of a future trade deal with the EU and my constituents. But Brexit also reveals the delusions of grandeur of this Tory government, as it will expose the power imbalance we face in the negotiations with the EU 27. The EU's own negotiating mandate contained an additional clause calling on both parties in the negotiation to address issues relating to the return or restitution of unlawfully removed cultural objects to their country of origin. It is utterly apparent to me, Mr Speaker, that Brexit will fuel demands for Britain to return the Elgin marbles to Greece. Greece's Culture Minister has left us all in no doubt on their position on the subject, saying that the right conditions have been created for their permanent return. Next year marks 200 years since the Greek uprising against Ottoman rule, so it should be of no surprise to ministers opposite that Athens will be stepping up its demands for the return of the marbles. And no doubt the Minister in her response will boast of the strength of the UK's negotiating position in the talks to come with the EU. I also expect that in her response she will repeat the same intransigent rhetoric that has been a hallmark of their position on the status of the Parthenon sculptures. Yet, as we've seen from this Tory government, throughout the Brexit process, the novel imperialist mindset is akin to the Emperor's new clothes. I fear that the UK Government are in for a very nasty surprise when we get down to the nitty-gritty of trade talks, and the calls for the Elgin marbles return to Greece may prove irresistible as negotiations drag on throughout this year. Whether by intention, Mr Speaker, or by accident, the UK Government may well lose its marbles much sooner than any of us have anticipated.